Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I've got to tell you that Monday we've got a very exciting special. The mess we're in is going to be all women to celebrate Women's Day, and we have Megan Murphy and Dee Dee's going to be on. Helen Stanland is hosting. It's going to be very exciting and lots of fun. I hope you will join us or join them for it. I am not allowed in, even though I do, as you know, identify sometimes as a lady. Today, I'm speaking again to Kate Coleman, who had her judicial review this week after quite a few delays and setbacks. And I asked her if she would pop in and let us know how it went. So here's Kate. Hello, Kate. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine. Thank you very much. It's not my judicial review.
Oh.
I just hasten to stress.
Yes, sorry. Who did bring it?
So I'll get into the whole breakdown of the judicial review, but it was brought by, the claimant is a female prisoner who was sexually assaulted by a male prisoner who identifies as transgender with a gender recognition certificate, who was being held for a conviction of serious sexual offences against women, and he was in the female estate with her. Yeah. Can I just do a quick plug for merch, because I did that last time, so it's sort of like a habit. We've got new T-shirts. Stella Parrott did this cartoon for us.
Excellent. Keep prison single sex. Yes, yes.
So we have that on T-shirts, hoodies, and tote bags.
Okay.
With mugs coming soon, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. So there's been a lot of delays.
There's been a lot of delays. Shall I just quickly, because we went into this quite a lot in October when we did our first interview, but shall I just quickly recap for people who might not know? Women's prisons, as we discussed last time, they're not single-sex institutions. They are now effectively mixed sex, because the Ministry of Justice policy, the prisons policy, is that male prisoners who identify as transgender and who have a gender recognition certificate, so they have gone through the process in the Gender Recognition Act and they have obtained legal recognition of their acquired gender, they have to be placed in the female prison estate. Male prisoners who identify as transgender but who have not been through this legal process, so they don't have a gender recognition certificate, they can still be held in the female estate if they make an application and it goes before a case board and the decision is made that that is the best place for them. So that is why we are in this situation. It's the Ministry of Justice policy. The whole history of housing male prisoners in the female estate goes back to at least the 1980s. So this is not a new thing. I won't go through all of that history now, but it's quite interesting. Well, I mean, interesting, it's horrifying, but it's interesting to see how the criteria for housing males in the female estate has changed over the years and why we're now in the situation that we're in. So that's the background. And as you say, we had the judicial review finally this week. I found out when I read the skeleton and in court that actually this was the fourth attempt to bring it to court.
Really? Yes.
I didn't realise we'd had quite so many sort of false starts on this, but we got it done. I say we, the legal team got it done, the claimant got it done. We had the 2 days in court in the High Court this week, Tuesday and Wednesday. And yes, so as we said, it's been brought by this, in my opinion, extremely courageous woman. I am full of admiration for her for bringing this, for sticking with it through all the delays, for still pressing ahead. And yes, she is a female prisoner. She was held obviously in the female prison estate, and whilst she was there, she encountered a male transgender prisoner with a gender recognition certificate who was serving an extremely lengthy sentence for very serious sexual offences against women. And he was in the female prison estate with her, and he sexually assaulted her. And there were other witness statements brought to court from other prisoners stating that they had also been sexually assaulted by him. And as we understand it, he is still in the general female population.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So let me ask, what came out this week that we didn't already know that might surprise people who've seen our previous interview?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was some interesting things that came out. There was some stuff that we did already know, which was confirmed, and there was some, to my mind, really quite shocking stuff that came out that we didn't know. So in terms of what we do know, and that what was confirmed again, is that the rate of sexual offending or convictions for sexual offences amongst this transgender male prison population is very high. The statistic that was quoted in court was around 50% of male prisoners who identify as transgender have at least one conviction for a sexual offence. More up-to-date data from the 2019 data collection point by the Ministry of Justice shows that male transgender prisoners who are held in the male estate, so therefore we know they are all biologically male, 57% have at least one conviction for a sexual offence. Now, when we look at the percentages for male prisoners, it's 17% or thereabouts, and for female prisoners, it's 3%.
Sorry. What is that last bit of data? What, 17%?
17% of male prisoners have at least one conviction for a sexual offence.
Okay.
So the 57% of transgender male prisoners who have a conviction for at least one sexual offence is far in excess of even the rate for men.
Right.
Far in excess. And certainly not even remotely near the 3% for women in prison who have a conviction for a sexual offence.
So 17% of 80,000 is...
Well, the total prison population is around 80,000. The female prison population, it's come down a bit in the last 12 months or so, and the figure that was quoted in court was around 3,100.
That's a huge amount of potential people identifying into... So 50% of these people are identifying as women, is that right?
Yes. 57% of the transgender male prison population who are held in male prisons, so we know that they are all biologically male, 57% of them have at least one conviction for a sexual offence.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I've lost my thread of the numbers, but I, something I always like to point out to people is that if all of these men who are identifying as women were allowed into the female estate, the prison population would just of sexual offenders amongst women would outnumber the women. It would be an extraordinary amount, wouldn't it?
And I think the other point to make about this is that having a conviction for a very serious sexual offence is not seen as a reason to prevent a male transgender prisoner with a gender recognition certificate from being housed in the female prison estate. That in and of itself is not seen as a reason to exclude that person from being housed in a women's prison. And I find that absolutely extraordinary.
I think one thing we know from this, Kate, is that people simply can't believe these facts because they're so extraordinary. Like when you think about the prison service and anything to do with criminality, you would think that the people in the prison service are well aware that the people they're dealing with are going to be lying and, you know, trying things on and doing whatever they can to either gain access to women or you know, get a softer sentence and stuff like that. How on earth have they allowed themselves to be fooled by these men?
Well, it beggars belief, but the point was made, which I think is a really fundamental point, is that, you know, it's the mere presence of any male prisoner in the female estate which is triggering and re-traumatizing for this population. Because as we discussed in our last interview in October, the female prison population is acknowledged throughout the criminal justice system as being exceptionally vulnerable. You know, we quoted that really shocking statistic that 65% of women in prison in one study were found to have had a traumatic brain injury, usually inflicted upon them at the hands of men, which is really quite shocking. So one of the pieces of evidence that was presented at court was a statement from the Prison Reform Trust, and I'll just read that out. It said that many women in prison have been victims of much more serious offences than the ones they are accused of, with a growing body of research indicating that women's exposure to physical, emotional and sexual abuse, including coercive control, is for some a driver of their offending. The starting point for the prison service throughout the criminal justice system is that you should assume that every woman you encounter in prison is coming from a situation of trauma, and you should approach her accordingly. So just the mere presence, even, you know, a nice male prisoner who's not going to get up to anything nefarious should not be there because of the impact. You know, and think about it, you know, these women, they know what male sexual violence looks like more than most populations of women in the wider community. They've experienced it, they've lived it, sometimes since childhood. And to be confronted with a male prisoner and to be told that this is a woman, that you should use female pronouns, that you should use their preferred name, and that you must agree that this person is as entitled to be in the female estate as you are. It's just shocking gaslighting. I mean, I couldn't comprehend, I can't comprehend what it would be like for that to be my reality. And of course, you know, you can't leave. They can't leave, obviously.
No,
they're in
you're
prison.
trapped with rapists.
With them, you have absolutely no choice.
It's just mind-blowing.
Absolutely shocking. I really
You know,
did.
another thing that people might not realize, I just posted a story about the BBC running a story on CBeebies, which is for toddlers, about a heterosexual couple. The bloke has long hair, so he's identifying as a female, and they called this heterosexual couple lesbians to do the CBeebies audience. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of women who are in prison because they haven't paid their TV license. You know, it's something like, it's a huge number. Do you know what it is?
You know, I attended a webinar which was given by Chris Dorr, QC, at the end of last week, and it wasn't about this at all. It was about sort of the future of prisons and looking at sort of offending and rehabilitation within that. It was really interesting. But one thing he said is that when you look at female offenders as opposed to male offenders, you find that female offenders are much more likely to be imprisoned for a first offence than male offenders, and that female offenders, they're more likely to get where there will be the option of giving a non-custodial sentence versus a custodial sentence. Women and men who are in that same category, women are more likely to be imprisoned, even if it's only for a very short period of time. But that has a massive disruption on their lives, on their children, on their family lives, and it just starts to perpetuate the whole cycle of, you know, chaotic lifestyles where you can't have the stability to start trying to rehabilitate and make more sensible from, not sensible from a societal point of view necessarily, but, you know, sensible from your own perspective, have the opportunity to start making those decisions.
Yes, so, but the reason I bring up the BBC is because being raped is quite a severe punishment for not paying your TV license.
Well, I mean, yes, this is a point I keep making in all of the very many consultation submissions that we are blessed with at the moment. I think I've made about 12 or 13 now, which seems rather excessive. But yes, the threat of sexual violence is not an ordinary consequence of lawful detention. It's not. Well, neither is the risk of pregnancy, whether that is through a consensual sexual relationship or through a forced one, a non-consensual situation of rape. That is not a normal consequence of lawful detention. No.
And the thing that it's a bit of a hobby horse for me, but the thing that really drives me crazy about this is that, like, Stonewall, who Alison Bailey released her letter this morning, or last night. And it's an extraordinary document, especially since they're defending Morgan Page, the author of the Overcoming the Cotton Ceiling workshop, which targets lesbian sexual boundaries. But the fact that Stonewall are going in and telling the BBC that heterosexual couples are actually lesbians, prisons that rapists are actually women, and Alison Bailey that she's a bigot. That she's a hateful bigot. Like, I mean, this is a very, very important part of what's going on, Kate, but it's a much bigger picture, isn't it? I think this is a scandal that's going to affect the whole country eventually.
Well, there were some interesting points which came up about the Equality Act and about data collection. So I'll tackle the Equality Act part of that first. So initially, the defence position, at least in part, rested on the fact that the Equality Act single-sex exceptions did not apply to the prison service, and the policy about housing transgender male prisoners within the female estate was based, at least in part, on that presumption. Now, looking at it, as this came out in in day 2, was that this was based on a narrow technical definition of what a service was, what communal accommodation was, and the definition of a public authority and a public function. The Secretary of State for Justice has now conceded that the prison service does constitute a service for at least some purposes. But I find that quite extraordinary. I'm not a lawyer. I can't get into the technical ins and outs of all of this and whether it's, legitimate or it's stretching the point. But if it is a legitimate thing, I find that absolutely extraordinary that branch, the Ministry of Justice, the prison service, and presumably other services as well, are able on a technicality to say the single-sex exceptions do not apply to us because we are not a service or a space or communal accommodation in this way. I find that extraordinary that you can, if you like, willfully decide to seize on that in order to make a set of decisions which clearly put women at risk.
I can't think of a more communal accommodation than the prison.
Well, exactly. I mean, we had a letter which was published in the Daily Telegraph on Thursday. There was a group of academics, former and current prison staff, lawyers, barristers, and we said that women's prisons are a definitive example of a single-sex space. If we can't get it right for women in prison, we can't get it right for anybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
So going back onto the Equality Act, what then came out, and this was one of the main parts of the defence argument was that the single-sex exceptions in the Equality Act, they are a statement of permission, that they are something that decision makers are allowed to rely on, but there is no obligation to rely on. So this means their position was that a decision maker, a policy maker, is free to ignore them in whole or in part, and if they choose to implement them in a slightly, I'd say, fudged way by using a different standard to exclude males, that is perfectly lawful. And, you know, if this is found to be correct, this means that females have absolutely no legal right to any space whatsoever that excludes males. And it doesn't matter what happens within that space. This means that hospitals, hospital wards, toilets, changing rooms, prisons,
nowhere is safe.
School toilet. Everything falls apart. And I just find that absolutely extraordinary. What it means, in effect, is that certainly at least that section of the legislation, it isn't a law, it's just merely a piece of paper. That's no basis for law. That is no basis for legislation at all, for it to just simply be words on a piece of paper that's a mere suggestion. So I find that really, really quite shocking.
Speaking of pieces of paper, I think it's quite important that the woman who brought the case, she was assaulted by someone who had a certificate, who had a gender, because that's often used in such a way as a kind of a gotcha. You know, people have a gender recognition certificate. That means they're, you know, female by law. And,
yes,
you
exactly.
know, but it's obvious that you know, like anyone can get one. Anyone can get one, and anyone can use it to get close to vulnerable women.
Well, I think the key point with this, and this is something that people are often not aware of, is that within the criteria that have to be met in order to get a gender recognition certificate, medical treatment and surgical treatment is not included. So that means that you can have a male who is wholly intact, indistinguishable from a male because he's male, but wholly intact with fully functioning male anatomy, who can get a gender recognition certificate. And I think a lot of people are under the misapprehension that having a gender recognition certificate means that you have had hormonal treatment or surgical treatment. I don't think that makes any difference. You know, if you're a surgically and medically altered male, you remain a male. But I think, you know, most people, when they realise what is actually being required of them to believe and what this prison policy actually states, it's really, you know, it's quite mind-blowing to them when they actually realise that.
That's one of the hard things about this, isn't it? It's really hard to get people to realise that they're not, when they're you know, calling women bigots and cutting off friends and family for having what they call bigoted opinions. I think often they think they're defending transsexuals, whereas we know, of course, the definition is so wide now that it's just anyone who says they're trans.
Well, exactly. Indeed it is. Can I quickly get on to data collection?
Sure, please do.
This is quite an interesting thing that came out. So we know that whenever the Ministry of Justice produces data on transgender prisoners, it excludes everybody with a gender recognition certificate. So for male transgender prisoners with a gender recognition certificate, they are recorded as female and as women in everything. So we knew that already, but the defence position was that to collect such data could be a criminal offence.
Wow.
Now, this is because there is a provision in the Gender Recognition Act regarding privacy, and it states that if you, I'm paraphrasing here because I haven't read it for a couple of weeks, but if you come into the possession of knowledge about somebody's gender recognition status in an official capacity, it's then a criminal offence to divulge it. So
even in statistics?
Well, if this is, I believe that this is overstating the effect of that provision. But if it isn't overstating the effect of that provision, this has a serious consequence for safeguarding and for risk assessment. And it is nonsensical that somebody's right to privacy can trump safeguarding and proper risk assessment in this fashion. I mean, we find that the attempt to criminalize all this is spreading. So there is a very mighty tome called the Equal Treatment Bench Book, which is a volume produced by the Judicial College. It provides non-binding guidance to the courts and to tribunals about how to provide an equitable court experience for certainly all the protected characteristics in the Equality Act, but also, you know, children, etc. You know, because everybody should have an equal right to access the law, and this volume is intended to facilitate that. So there's a chapter on transgender people, trans people, and it states in there, firstly, that somebody's gender identity for the purpose of court proceedings can be very easily ascertained pretty much on the basis of self-ID. Secondly, that misgendering somebody could be a criminal act. Thirdly, that dead naming somebody could be a criminal act. And fourthly, it exhorts judges to be aware that a litigant in opposition may choose to try to leverage somebody's transgender status by the use of the wrong pronouns or by dead naming as to kind of get a tactical advantage. So you need to be aware of that. Now, we know from Maria McLachlan, right, that she was scolded by a judge in her case, where she
punched by a man, punched by a man, to call her she, extraordinary.
To call him she, and she could not and would not do that. And bravo to her for not doing that. We also know that there are cases of males who have been on trial for sexual offences, and the witness statements of their victim, they've had to use female pronouns. So we know that this is happening. And, you know, what are you going to do if you're a judge in court, right? You're a magistrate and somebody comes up. What are you going to do? Are you actually going to risk there being you facilitating a criminal act in your court, or are you going to clamp down further?
So it seems like, I mean, I remember there was often a kind of right-wing trope along the lines of, what about the victims, you know? But I've never seen such a concerted effort to enable and empower criminals. You know, it's like dead naming is a great example. Dead naming. So you're not allowed to talk about who the person was before they became the woman, you know? Misgendering. You're not allowed to tell the truth about the reality of a sexual assault. It's like they're creating a kind of a invisibility shield for these men.
Well, yes. I mean, you know, when you have a sacred caste that you cannot challenge, right?
Yes.
You need to start asking questions as to why.
Yes.
I mean, there's a brief sort of divergence. The situation in Scotland, as we discussed back in October, is even worse than the situation in England and Wales. This judicial review relates to the Ministry of Justice policy for England and Wales. The Scottish Prison Service policy, I was having a look through some of the Freedom of Information Access requests that have been made in relation to that. And what I found out was really quite shocking. So we know from last time I told you that the policy, which was written in 2014, it's got the logos of Scottish Trans Alliance on the front cover and Stonewall Scotland on the front cover. Yeah. It came to light in 2018 that our old friend James Morton, who was of Scottish Trans Alliance at that time, he wrote the policy.
Yeah.
He wrote the policy. If you look at the equality impact assessments that were made before the policy was formally adopted, and those have been made available through Freedom of Information Access requests, you find out that although transgender prisoners, transgender people in the community, and 2 organisations representing transgender interests, Scottish Trans Alliance and Stonewall Scotland, were consulted, women in prison weren't, and neither was any organisation representing the interests of women in prison. Sex was not included in the list of protected characteristics, which had to be taken into consideration. And the evidence considered in relation to equality groups was only presented in consideration of transgender people. So you can see that, you know, women are not in that policy. Women were not even an afterthought. Yeah. They were no thought. No thought at all.
It's been the case again and again.
It's been the case again and again. I mean, there was the case that I know we've referred to in the past, which actually cropped up in the judicial review, and that was the transgender male prisoner who was currently serving a sentence for attempted rape and had previously had a conviction for, I believe it was manslaughter. I had thought it was murder, but I think it's actually manslaughter. Oh, yes. And he had got his gender recognition certificate, but wasn't able to access his reassignment surgery until he'd been transferred to the female estate and was able to prove that he could live as a woman. So the ruling, the judgment in that case was that firstly, it would be irrational not to house him in the female estate. And secondly, it would be a breach of his Article 8 rights to privacy. So again, women weren't considered at all. I mean, I say they weren't considered at all. They were considered. Let me see if I can find a quote because it is quite horrifying. And I've put it over here. Give me 1 second. No, I can't find it. Anyway, I can more or less remember it.
Go ahead.
This Dr. James Barrett, who at the time was the head of the Gender Identity Clinic, and he stated, as paraphrasing, that placing this male prisoner in the female estate shouldn't really cause any problems, and the only type of woman who would start making a fuss about it was the type of woman who simply enjoyed conflict.
Oh, yes. I remember that quote. Yes. Extraordinary. Extraordinary.
I mean,
what is wrong with people? Why don't, you know, it's like Me Too happened like just a few years ago, and everyone has forgotten what men are like, you know, and what criminal men are like. How could judges and the prison service and all these organizations be involved in what seems like handing the keys of the hospital to Jimmy Savile, you know?
I know. I mean, do we not learn?
No.
Not.
Yeah.
Clearly not. Another thing that came up was that in November last year, November 2020, the then minister, Lucy Fraser, she's just recently moved on to other things and been replaced, but the then minister, Lucy Fraser, she looked at the policy about housing transgender male prisoners in the female estate, and she reconfirmed that it was the correct course of action. And, you know, the defense kept saying, you know, this is a very, very difficult area. It's so hard to get the balance right. Yes. It's really not.
No.
It's not difficult at all. It's only difficult if you're working on the prior assumption that it's correct to house at least some male prisoners in the female estate. Then you've got to decide who, under what circumstances, then it becomes a difficult decision.
Yes.
But it was open to Lucy Fraser at that time, and this is, you know, even on the defence's own admission, the single-sex exceptions in the Equality Act, they are available as a legitimate solution in order to exclude all males from a single-sex space for women. So that was available and open to Lucy Fraser to take that option, and she declined. She declined because she decided it was still appropriate to house at least some male prisoners in the female estate. Why? She needs to answer why.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, you know, I mean, it's such a strange situation we find ourselves in, because I every day I just get blown away again by what's going on. You know, it's like a mass hypnosis, mass stupidity. I wouldn't know what to call it. It's just crazy. But like, it sounds that it was a good week, though. Were you optimistic by the end of it?
I don't know. I hope that justice will prevail. I very much hope so. I think in part it depends on whether the judges believe that the defence analysis of the Equality Act exceptions and their application is correct. If they believe it's correct, then the policies are arguably not lawful. I mean, there was other stuff to do with human rights law and Articles 3, 8 and 14, which I haven't gone into. I've just focused on the Equality Act. But as I understand it, the job in a judicial review is to find out whether the law was followed. It's not to make a decision about whether the law is stupid.
Right. Okay.
Although, you know, possibly that you know, with a particularly testy judge, that could be part of the judgment. Yes,
I did notice
that as it may, we think that this is a ridiculous state of affairs. So we'll see. I mean, the defence counsel primarily there's a couple of requests for the claimants counsel, but they were required to provide written information to the court, which includes a full breakdown of transgender prisoner statistics, including GRC havers. So that's going to be quite interesting to see how and when the government provides that. So the deadline for that was the 12th of March, which isn't long. And then, you know, I mean, we've seen the sort of timelines for the other JRs, so I wouldn't have thought we'd have a decision for at least a couple of months after the written information has been provided to court. But yeah.
So that's the next time we should probably meet up and have a chat. Is in a couple of months. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless something else happens in the meantime, of course.
Well, if it does, just let me know, and I'd love to have you back. Is there anything you want to say before we sign off? Is there anything people can do to help? And
I'll be updating the website next week with what people can do to help. There is a sort of draft letter there that people can send to their MPs, which was dated from October. But I will be updating that over the next week or so. Okay,
I really hope we win, because
oh God, yes, definitely.
What a terrifying thing to think that we would put vulnerable women to punish them in a place where they might get sexually assaulted.
Exactly.
It's extraordinary. Kay, you're doing wonderful work. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
And I'll see you in a few months, if not sooner.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bye.
Right. Let me end the broadcast, and we will hang around for a chat.
Oh, that was all right, apart from the